Before we begin, I want to tell you something that most history teachers never mention, something so strange about the Vikings that once you hear it, you will not be able to stop thinking about it. The Vikings reached North America 500 years before Christopher Columbus. We are not talking about a legend or a theory. We are talking about confirmed, excavated, carbon-dated archaeological evidence at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, a Viking settlement built around 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But here is the part that really keeps me up at night. The Vikings didn't just visit. They brought women, they built permanent structures, they smelted iron, they stayed. And then, for reasons we still do not fully understand, they left. They abandoned the New World, and for 500 years, nobody came back. What happened? Why did they leave? What did they find there that made them decide that the land Columbus would later call a paradise was not worth keeping? That is one of the questions we are going to answer tonight, along with why did a people from a frozen peninsula in northern Europe somehow manage to raid every coastline from Ireland to Baghdad? How did the same culture that gave us berserkers, warriors so terrifying they fought in a trance and could not be stopped by wounds, also give us the most sophisticated legal system in medieval Europe? And why, when the rest of Europe was building cathedrals and writing theology, were the Vikings carving stories of gods who were going to lose at the end of the world, and they were completely fine with that? Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight's story is the Vikings. 2 hours. Pour yourself something warm and stay with me, because this story starts out sounding like action and adventure, and it ends up being something much stranger and much more interesting than that. It ends up being about us. The first thing we need to do is destroy the image of the Viking that lives in your head, the horned helmet. That is a myth, completely made up. The very few Viking-era helmets that have actually been found, and there are almost none because iron was valuable and was recycled, not buried, have no horns. The horned helmet was invented by a 19th century costume designer for a Swedish opera, and it stuck. Every Halloween costume, every movie poster, every cartoon Viking is wearing something that never existed. The word Viking itself is also more specific than most people realize. Viking is not an ethnicity, it is not a nationality, it is a job description. The Old Norse word Viking most likely means something like to go on a sea raid or to go out on expedition. A person who went Viking was a Viking while they were doing it. When they came home, farmed their land, raised their children, and attended the local legal assembly, they were Norsemen or Danes or Norwegians, not Vikings. Vikings were a subset of Norsemen, not all of them. The actual people we call Vikings came from the Scandinavian peninsula and Denmark, what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They spoke Old Norse, a Germanic language from which modern Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are all descended. They shared cultural practices, religious beliefs, and social structures, though there were regional differences. Norwegian Vikings tended to go west, to Scotland, Ireland, England, Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Swedish Vikings tended to go east, through Russia, down the great rivers to Constantinople and Baghdad. Danish Vikings tended to go south, into England, France, and eventually into the Mediterranean. Norsemen were farmers and fishermen first. Most of them never went on a raid in their lives. The image of the Viking as a purely destructive force, burning monasteries, carrying off screaming monks, is the picture painted by the people they attacked, who happened to be the literate ones who wrote things down. Monks write about Viking raids with the same objectivity as a mugging victim writing a character reference. What survives of Norse writing, the sagas, the law codes, the poetry, shows a society of extraordinary sophistication and complexity. The Viking Age is typically dated from 793 to 1066 AD, from the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in northeastern England to the Norman conquest of England at the Battle of Hastings. That is 273 years. In those 273 years, Norsemen colonized Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, founded the city of Dublin, established the Duchy of Normandy in France, created the Kievan Rus, the first Russian state, served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, and discovered and settled more new territory than any other people on Earth during that period. To understand why the Viking Age began when it did, why it erupted so suddenly and so violently in the late 8th century, we need to understand what Scandinavia was like in the centuries before. Scandinavia in the early medieval period was a hard land. The Norwegian coast, in particular, is a landscape of extreme contrasts, deep fjords cutting inland from the sea, dramatic mountains rising almost immediately behind the coastal strip, and a growing season so short that agriculture was always precarious. The only substantial agricultural land was in river valleys and along the fjords. Everything else was rock, ice, or deep forest. Population pressure was constant. The Norse system of inheritance divided land among all sons, which meant that over generations, farms became smaller and smaller until they could barely support a family. Younger sons, inheriting almost nothing, faced a choice: stay and work as a hired hand on someone else's land, or find another way. The sea was the other way. The Norse relationship with the sea was unlike almost anything in the contemporary world. The fjords of western Norway created natural harbors and natural highways. From childhood, Norse people were comfortable on water in ways that continental Europeans were not. They developed the most advanced boat-building technology of their era, culminating in the longship, a vessel of such elegant engineering that it would not be significantly improved upon for centuries. Iron was also available in Scandinavia in a form unique to the region, bog iron, which formed naturally in peat bogs and could be smelted without the complex mining operations required elsewhere. This gave Norse smiths a reliable source of iron for tools and weapons. The combination of excellent boats, iron weapons, and desperate younger sons with nothing to lose was about to change the world. The longship is the defining technology of the Viking Age, the instrument that made everything else possible. Without it, there are no raids, no settlements, no trade routes across Russia to Baghdad. The longship is to the Viking Age what the steam engine is to the Industrial Revolution, the technology that made a new kind of world. What made the longship revolutionary was not any single feature, but the combination of features. It was clinker-built, meaning the hull planks overlapped each other like scales on a fish, fastened with iron rivets and caulked with tarred wool or animal hair. This construction method made the hull flexible rather than rigid. In open ocean, this was crucial. A flexible hull could absorb the stresses of waves that would crack a rigid hull apart. The longship did not fight the sea, it moved with it. The hull was also extraordinarily shallow. Some longships drew less than a meter of water fully loaded. This meant they could navigate rivers and approach beaches where no other ocean-going vessel could follow. Viking warriors could sail across the open Atlantic, turn up a river, row to within a few hundred meters of their target, pull the ship onto the beach, raid, and be back at sea before a mounted response could arrive. Speed and surprise were the longship's tactical gifts. A typical longship was 20 to 30 meters long, powered by a single square sail and by oarsmen between 20 and 60 rowers, one per oar. The ships were steered by a large oar mounted on the right side of the stern, the steerboard side. The English word starboard for the right side of a ship comes directly from the Norse stornbordi, the steering oar side. Every time a sailor says starboard, they are speaking Old Norse. The largest Viking ships we know of, the longships used by kings for war rather than by farmers for raiding, were enormous. The Roskilde 6, fragments of which were discovered in Denmark and are now in the British Museum, was approximately 37 meters long when complete. It would have required 78 rowers. It was, by any measure, one of the most impressive ships built anywhere in the world before the age of industrial shipbuilding. June 8, 793 A.D. The monastery of Lindisfarne on a small island off the northeastern coast of England. The monks have been there for over 100 years. It is one of the most important centers of Christian learning in the British Isles, home to the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most beautiful manuscripts ever produced. It is a peaceful, sacred place. It is about to become the most famous crime scene in medieval European history. The Norse ships appeared without warning. There may have been signs the monks interpreted as omens. A contemporary chronicler named Alcuin mentions whirlwinds, lightning storms, and fiery dragons flying across the sky in the preceding months. Whether these were real weather events, aurora borealis sightings, or literary embellishment added after the fact, nobody knows. What is certain is that when the longships beached on Lindisfarne that June morning, the monks were completely unprepared. The raiders killed some of the monks, threw others into the sea, and took the youngest and most valuable as slaves. They looted the church of its gold and silver treasures, the accumulated piety of a century of donations by Anglo-Saxon kings and nobles. They were gone before any military response was possible. The entire raid probably took no more than a few hours. The impact on Christian Europe was enormous, not because of the scale of the violence, which was modest by the standards of medieval warfare, but because of what the target represented. Lindisfarne was not just any monastery. It was a sacred place, protected by the sanctity of its founding saint, Cuthbert. The idea that God would allow pagans to sack one of the most holy sites in England was theologically disturbing in a way that a raid on a town or a fort would not have been. Alcuin of York, the greatest scholar in Europe at the time and a former teacher at Charlemagne's court, wrote a letter that is essentially a panic attack in Latin. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. He interpreted it as divine punishment for the sins of the English people. What he could not know was that this was just the beginning. The raid on Lindisfarne was not random, and the timing, the late 8th century rather than some other period, was not accidental. Historians have been arguing for generations about what triggered the Viking Age, and the answer is almost certainly multiple factors converging at the same moment. Population pressure, as we discussed, was real. Scandinavian population had been growing during the warmer climate of the early medieval period, filling available agricultural land. By the late 8th century, there was genuine land hunger, particularly in western Norway, where the terrain limited expansion. The political consolidation of Scandinavia also played a role.
As stronger kings emerged and began consolidating power, Harald Fairhair in Norway being the most famous example. They drove out rivals and dispossessed lesser chieftains. The men who lost these power struggles faced a simple choice: submit to a new overlord or leave. Many left by sea. The vulnerability of the targets was also a significant factor. In the 8th century, the coastlines and river systems of Western Europe were largely undefended. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was focused on land warfare. English kingdoms did not maintain coast guards. Monasteries were built in beautiful, isolated locations precisely because isolation from worldly distraction was spiritually valuable, which meant they had no walls and no defenders. The Norse raiders were not discovering vulnerability. They were exploiting existing vulnerability that had simply never been systematically exploited before. And finally, and this is the factor that gets less attention than it deserves, the Norse were responding to external pressure from the south. Charlemagne's brutal forced conversion of the Saxons in the 770s and 780s, in which Charlemagne killed thousands of Saxons who refused baptism in what is called the Massacre of Verdun, pushed directly against the borders of Scandinavia. The message to the Norse was clear: Christianity and Frankish power were coming. The raids on Christian monasteries and Christian territories may have been, at least partly, a preemptive strike.
Before we follow the Vikings across Europe, we need to understand the worldview they carried with them, because Norse religion is one of the strangest and most psychologically interesting religious systems ever developed, and it shaped everything about how the Norse people saw themselves and their fate. The Norse cosmos was held up by a vast tree, Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose branches reached the realm of the gods, the Aesir living in Asgard. At its roots were Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, and Muspelheim, the realm of fire. In between were realms for giants, dwarves, elves, and humans. The world was not created in peace or love. It was created from the body of a slaughtered giant named Ymir, whose flesh became the earth, whose blood became the seas, whose bones became the mountains, and whose skull became the sky. The chief god was Odin, All-Father, god of wisdom, war, death, and poetry. Odin had sacrificed one of his eyes by throwing it into the well of Mimir in exchange for wisdom. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days, pierced by his own spear, to gain the knowledge of runes, the magical writing system. He sent his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, across the world each day to bring him information. He wandered the world in disguise, gathering knowledge, testing heroes. Thor, son of Odin, was the most widely worshipped of the Norse gods, god of thunder, storms, and the protection of mankind. His weapon, Mjolnir, the hammer, was the most powerful weapon in the cosmos. Thor's role was to defend Asgard from the giants, and he was also the approachable, direct, physically capable protector that ordinary Norse people called on in daily life. Odin was for kings and poets. Thor was for farmers. But here is what makes Norse religion unique and psychologically fascinating. The gods were going to lose. At Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, Odin would be devoured by the great wolf Fenrir. Thor would kill the world serpent Jormungandr and then die from its poison. The fire giant Surt would burn the world. The gods knew this. They prepared for it anyway. They gathered the best warriors to fight beside them at the end, not because they could win, because how you face the inevitable defines who you are.
The Norse ethos was not optimism, it was defiance. Valhalla, Valhall in Old Norse, the Hall of the Slain, was Odin's mead hall in Asgard. It had 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to walk through side by side. Its rafters were spears, its roof was covered with shields. It was where the Einherjar, the chosen dead warriors, feasted and trained every day for the Battle of Ragnarok. The Valkyries, Odin's warrior maidens, rode across battlefields choosing which warriors died and which survived. Those chosen for Valhalla died gloriously, carried away by the Valkyries to spend eternity fighting and feasting with Odin. This was the highest honor available to a Norse warrior. To die in bed of illness or old age was, in contrast, called a straw death, a death so ordinary and undignified that some Norse people believed it might prevent entry to Valhalla. This theology produced warriors of terrifying effectiveness. Norse warriors who believed they might be chosen for Valhalla had dramatically reduced fear of death. The berserkers, from the Old Norse berserk, probably meaning bear shirt, referring to warriors who wore bearskins or channeled the spirit of the bear, took this further. Berserkers fought in a state of ritual frenzy, apparently impervious to pain, biting their shields, howling, attacking everything around them regardless of danger to themselves. Ancient sources describe berserkers as effective but socially problematic. A warrior who cannot be turned off is useful in battle and terrifying in peacetime. Norwegian law in the early 11th century actually prohibited berserker behavior, suggesting it was a real phenomenon that real societies had to manage. The Icelandic sagas are full of berserkers causing problems for their communities in between battles. The Norse warrior culture also had a sophisticated concept of honor, drengskap, the quality of being a dreng, an honorable man. A dreng was brave, generous, loyal, kept his word, and faced adversity without complaint. The insult nidding, roughly meaning a coward, an oath-breaker, a man without honor, was one of the most serious social condemnations possible. Norse society ran on reputation. A man's word and a man's courage were not just personal virtues, they were social currency.
For the first century of the Viking Age, Norse raids on England followed a pattern. Arrive fast, loot, leave. Summer raids, in and out. The monasteries of the eastern coasts were stripped one by one. York was raided. London was raided. But England, divided into competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, remained Anglo-Saxon. Then, in 865 AD, everything changed. A fleet of longships landed on the east coast of England that was unlike anything that had come before. This was not a raiding party. This was an army. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the great contemporary English historical record, called it the Mickle Heathen Heer, the Great Heathen Army. Modern historians estimate it may have numbered between 500 and 1,000 warriors, small by later medieval standards, but enormous by the mobile Viking raid standards of the previous century. Who led this army? According to Norse legend and later sagas, the great heathen army was led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubi. Ragnar Lothbrok himself may or may not have been a real historical figure. The sagas are unclear, but the tradition holds that he had raided England and France and met his end thrown into a pit of snakes by the Northumbrian king Ella. His sons came back for revenge. Whether the revenge motive was real or a later legend added by storytellers, the Great Heathen Army's campaign was devastating. Within 3 years, they had captured and killed King Ella of Northumbria, according to the sagas, by the ritual of the blood eagle, in which the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and the lungs pulled out to form wings. Whether the blood eagle was a real ritual or a literary invention is still debated by historians. What is not debated is that King Ella died and Northumbria fell. By 869, East Anglia had fallen. King Edmund of East Anglia was captured, tied to a tree, shot with arrows, and beheaded, according to later tradition, for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. He became Saint Edmund, martyr. By 874, Mercia had fallen. Only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained, Wessex, and it had one remaining king who seemed capable of fighting back, a 21-year-old named Alfred. Alfred of Wessex is one of the most remarkable figures in medieval European history, and his story intersects with the Vikings at every point. He was the only English king ever given the title the Great, and he earned it not through conquest, but through survival, adaptation, and extraordinary personal resilience. In January 878 AD, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Alfred's court at Chippenham. Alfred barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers. For months, he hid in the Somerset levels, boggy, impassable terrain that the Norse cavalry could not easily penetrate. English legend preserves this period with the famous story of Alfred sheltering with a peasant woman who scolded him for letting her cakes burn while he was lost in thought about his kingdom. The story is almost certainly invented, but it captures something true about Alfred's situation. The King of Wessex, theoretical ruler of the last surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom, was in hiding in a swamp, burning cakes. What Alfred did next was not immediately military. He used the months in the marshes to rebuild. He sent messengers to the loyal nobility of Wessex, calling in every obligation, every oath of loyalty. He built up an intelligence network. He reorganized the Wessex military system, creating a network of burhs, fortified towns spaced a day's ride apart, which could provide mutual support and prevent the rapid Norse cavalry raids that had destroyed his predecessors. In May 878, Alfred emerged from the marshes, gathered his forces, and met Guthrum's army at the Battle of Edington. He won a decisive victory, the most important battle fought on English soil between the Roman withdrawal and the Norman conquest. Guthrum, cornered and forced to negotiate, agreed to a remarkable settlement. He would accept Christian baptism, with Alfred as his godfather, and he and his followers would withdraw to the Danelaw, a defined territory in the north and east of England where Norse settlers could live under their own law. Alfred did not stop at the military victory. He began a systematic program of translation, bringing key Latin texts into Old English so that literacy could spread beyond the church. He reformed the law codes. He founded schools. He rebuilt London after recapturing it from Viking occupation. Alfred understood with unusual clarity for his era that military victory alone was not enough. He had to give the English people something worth defending.
The Danelaw, the territory in northern and eastern England under Norse law and Norse rule, is one of the most fascinating chapters of the Viking Age because it shows the other side of the Norse story. Not the raider, but the settler. Not the destroyer, but the builder. The Norse settlers of the Danelaw brought with them their language, their legal customs, their place names, and their agricultural practices. The English place name map of northern and eastern England is still saturated with Old Norse. Place names ending in by, meaning farm or village, come from the Norse: Derby, Grimsby, Whitby, Rugby, Selby. Place names ending in thorp, a secondary settlement, are Norse. Place names ending in thwaite, a clearing, are Norse. Toft, dale, holm, wick, all Norse. Walk through Yorkshire or Lincolnshire, and you are walking through a landscape named in Old Norse. The Norse settlers intermarried with Anglo-Saxon communities. They adopted Christianity, often fairly quickly, within a generation. The Norse god Thor's hammer amulets have been found alongside Christian cross amulets in the same graves, suggesting people were hedging their theological bets during the transition. Norsemen with Norse names appear in English legal documents as landowners, merchants, and witnesses. The separation between Viking and English blurred rapidly. This is the pattern that repeats everywhere the Norse settled: initial violence, followed by settlement, followed by assimilation. The Norse who settled in Normandy, France, were speaking French within 2 generations. The Norse who settled in Ireland founded Dublin, but also became deeply integrated into Irish culture. The Norse who settled in Russia became, within a few generations, indistinguishable from Slavic Russians, except for their ruling dynasty's originally Norse names: Rurik, Oleg, Igor. The Danelaw was eventually reconquered by Alfred's descendants, his son Edward the Elder and his grandson Athelstan, who became the first king of all England in 927 AD. But the Norse influence never left. Modern English owes hundreds of words directly to Old Norse: sky, skin, skull, knife, window, husband, egg, anger, ugly, awkward, die, get, give, take, want, trust, call, raise, hit, run. When you say they are, you are using the Old Norse form. The Old English form was they be on. The Norse language is woven into the fabric of every English sentence. While Norse raiders were reshaping England, other Viking fleets were pushing deeper into the Frankish Empire, what is now France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The rivers of France were highways into the heart of Europe, and the Norse used them with devastating efficiency. The Loire, the Seine, the Garonne, all were repeatedly raided. Nantes was sacked in 843 AD, with the bishop killed at the altar during a church service. Bordeaux fell. The Norse wintered on islands in the Seine and Loire, using them as permanent bases from which to raid inland. Paris, sitting at the confluence of the Seine and its tributary the Marne, became the most symbolically important target. The first major attack on Paris came in 845 AD, when a fleet reportedly of 120 ships and 5,000 men, probably an exaggeration, but certainly enormous, sailed up the Seine under a leader the Frankish sources call Ragnar. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to go away. The Norse went away. They also made a mental note about how effectively the payment of silver worked. The Great Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 AD was a different matter entirely. A Norse fleet of between 700 and 1,000 ships, again probably exaggerated but certainly enormous, appeared at Paris and demanded that the Frankish Count Odo allow them to pass upriver to raid Burgundy. Odo refused. What followed was a year-long siege that is one of the most dramatic events of the entire Viking Age. The Norse assaulted the bridges of Paris repeatedly with siege engines, battering rams, catapults, fireboats.
The defenders under Count Odo and Bishop Goslin held the bridges with desperate determination. The Norse tried to drain the river. They tried to fill the moat. They tried mining under the towers. None of it worked. When King Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief army, he did what Frankish kings had been doing for decades. He paid the Norse to go away and raid somewhere else instead. Count Odo, who had actually done the fighting, was furious. His fury eventually made him king.
The Norse settlement of what would become Normandy is one of the most consequential events in European history, not because of the settlement itself, but because of what the settlers' descendants would do 3 generations later. In 911 AD, a Norse chieftain named Rollo, so large that no horse could carry him, the sources claim, so he walked everywhere, made a deal with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. The deal was essentially the same structure Alfred had used with Guthrum. Rollo would accept Christian baptism, swear loyalty to the Frankish king, and in exchange receive control of the land around Rouen at the mouth of the Seine. In return, Rollo's men would defend the Seine against other Norse raiders. The ceremony of submission was apparently not entirely dignified. Rollo was supposed to kiss the king's foot as a gesture of fealty. He refused to kneel. One of his men knelt on his behalf, grabbed the king's foot, and lifted it to his own mouth while standing, dumping the king backwards off his throne. The Norse found this hilarious. The Frankish courtiers presumably did not. What happened next was the same story as the Danelaw, but faster and more complete. Rollo's Norse settlers were speaking French within 2 generations. They converted thoroughly to Christianity. They adopted Frankish feudal practices. The territory became Normandy, Normanorum, the land of the Northmen. And the Norman culture that emerged was a unique fusion of Norse energy and aggression with Frankish administrative sophistication and Christian religious intensity. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson was William, Duke of Normandy. In 1066, William crossed the English Channel with an army of Normans, men who were, in blood and culture, 3 generations removed from Norse raiders, and conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman conquest transformed the English language, the English aristocracy, and English law. Every English monarch since 1066 is a direct or indirect descendant of Rollo, the Norse chieftain, who refused to kiss the king's foot. The Vikings did not just raid England, they eventually owned it. While Norwegian and Danish Vikings were reshaping Western Europe, Swedish Vikings, the ones history calls Varangians or Rus, were doing something equally extraordinary in the East. They were traveling the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, trading, raiding, and eventually founding the first Russian state. The river routes east were ancient trading paths. The Varangians used the Volga River to reach the Caspian Sea and the great Arab trading cities of the east. They used the Dnieper River to reach the Black Sea and Constantinople, the wealthiest city in the Christian world. Archaeologists have found enormous quantities of Arabic silver coins, dirhams, in Scandinavian graves, evidence of how much silver flowed west along the Volga route. Norse artifacts have been found as far east as the Caspian coast. Arab traders encountered Norse merchants and left detailed descriptions of their customs. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan met a group of Rus merchants on the Volga in 921 AD and left the most detailed contemporary description of Norse people that survives. His description of their appearance, tall, fair, tattooed with trees and patterns from fingernails to neck, is vivid.
His description of a Viking ship burial, in which a chieftain's body was burned on his ship, along with a slave girl who had volunteered to accompany him to the afterlife, is one of the most disturbing and unforgettable passages in medieval literature. The funeral involved rituals Ibn Fadlan found deeply alien and deeply disturbing. He recorded them with meticulous precision. Along the Dnieper route, Varangian traders and warriors established a series of fortified trading posts. The most important was at Kiev, modern Kyiv, where the chieftain Oleg established control around 882 AD. Oleg was Varangian. His name is Norse, derived from Helgi. His successor, Ingor, Norse Ingvar. Igor's widow, Olga, Norse Helga. The founding dynasty of Kievan Rus, the first Russian state, was Norse. The name Rus itself probably comes from the Finnish word for the Norse traders, Ruotsi, still the Finnish word for Sweden today. The relationship between the Varangians and the Byzantine Empire was extraordinary. Norse warriors served as mercenaries in the Byzantine army from the 9th century onward. By the early 11th century, the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard, the Varangian Guard, was composed almost entirely of Norse warriors, later including Anglo-Saxon warriors who had fled England after the Norman conquest. They were the most elite soldiers in the most sophisticated city on earth, and they were Vikings.
Iceland is one of the most remarkable experiments in human settlement in all of history. An island in the North Atlantic, 1,000 kilometers from the nearest landmass, with no indigenous human population, discovered by Norse sailors and settled entirely by deliberate immigration between approximately 874 and 930 AD. In less than 60 years, Norse settlers created a society from nothing, and the society they created was unlike anything in contemporary Europe. The settlement of Iceland was driven by the political consolidation of Norway. Harald Fairhair, whose hair was reportedly so magnificent that he vowed not to cut or comb it until he had unified all of Norway, which he eventually accomplished, was creating a kingdom that had no room for independent chieftains. Those chieftains who would not accept subordination had two choices: submit or leave. Many left west, across the North Atlantic. The Landnama Book, the Book of Settlements, preserves the names of approximately 400 original settlers and their families, along with where they came from and where they settled. It is one of the most extraordinary demographic documents from the medieval world. The settlers were mostly Norwegian, but they brought with them slaves and settlers from Ireland and Scotland. The Irish monks who had already established hermitages in Iceland, and the Celtic slaves and servants who accompanied Norse masters. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders confirm both the Scandinavian and the Celtic heritage. What the settlers created in 930 AD was the Althing, the world's first parliament. Every free man in Iceland met once a year at Thingvellir, the Parliament Plains, for 2 weeks to make laws, settle disputes, conduct business, and hear cases. There was no king, there was no standing army, there was no central executive. Iceland was governed by law, by consensus, and by the social pressure of a small community where everyone knew everyone. The Althing is still in existence today, making it the oldest functioning parliament in the world. Modern Iceland's parliament meets in Reykjavik and is still called the Althing. The democratic tradition that the Norse settlers established on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic in 930 AD has a continuous institutional existence of over 1,000 years. If Iceland was the Norse settlers' first great experiment in creating a society from nothing, Greenland was the second and stranger chapter.
and it begins with a man exiled for killing someone. Erik Thorvaldsson, Erik the Red, named for his red hair and red beard, was a Norwegian who had emigrated to Iceland with his father after his father was exiled from Norway for killing a man. Erik then managed to get himself exiled from Iceland, also for killing a man. This was a man who had trouble with neighbors, but he was also, apparently, an extraordinary sailor and explorer. Exiled from Iceland for 3 years around 982 AD, Erik sailed west into the unknown. He found a large island, the world's largest island, that had been briefly visited by a Norse sailor named Gunnbjorn, but never settled. Erik spent his 3 years of exile exploring its coasts. He found that the southwestern coast, sheltered by the Cape from the worst weather, had fjords with green grass and relatively mild temperatures. He named it Greenland. This was, as historians have noted ever since, excellent marketing for a place that is mostly covered in ice. When Erik returned to Iceland after his exile ended, he recruited settlers. Around 985 AD, he led a fleet of 25 ships back to Greenland. Only 14 made it through the North Atlantic. The others turned back or were lost. But those 14 ships carried enough settlers to establish 2 communities, the eastern settlement near modern Qaqortoq and the western settlement further north. At their peak, the Norse Greenland communities may have numbered around 3,000 to 4,000 people, living in farms, raising cattle and sheep, hunting walruses and seal, and trading walrus ivory and live polar bears to the markets of Europe. The Greenland settlement lasted for approximately 500 years, one of the longest surviving Norse settlements outside Scandinavia. It was also one of the most psychologically extraordinary, a small community at the very edge of the habitable world, maintaining European cultural practices and Christian religious observance in almost total isolation. The last known written record from the Greenland Norse community is a 1408 marriage record. After that, silence. They disappeared. The reasons why are one of history's great mysteries, and we will return to them.
And now we arrive at the story that opened this whole video, the one I told you would make you unable to stop thinking. The Vikings in North America. Leif Erikson was the son of Erik the Red. He'd grown up in Greenland, been educated partly in Norway, and had converted to Christianity. He was actually sent by the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason to bring Christianity to Greenland. He was a capable, well-connected man with the exploring instinct of his father. Around 1000 AD, Leif sailed west from Greenland, following directions given by a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had spotted unknown land to the west some years earlier, but had not gone ashore. Leif went ashore. He found 3 places, a land of flat rocks he called Helluland, probably Baffin Island, a land of flat forest he called Markland, probably Labrador, and a land of wild grapes and mild temperatures he called Vinland, almost certainly the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. The site at Lonso Meadows, excavated beginning in 1960 by the Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Steen, is the only confirmed Norse site in North America. The excavations found the remains of 8 buildings, the same style of turf construction used in Iceland and Greenland, along with iron boat rivets, a spindle whorl indicating the presence of women, and a bronze cloak pin of distinctively Norse design. Carbon dating placed the site at approximately 1000 AD. There is no doubt this was a Norse settlement in North America, predating Columbus by roughly 500 years.
The sagas describe subsequent expeditions to Vinland by Leif's brothers and by a woman named Gudrid, who bore the first European child born in the Americas, a boy named Snorri. They also described conflict with the indigenous people they called Skrælings, probably Dorset culture people, or early Beothuks. The Norse had iron weapons, and the Skrælings did not, but the Skrælings vastly outnumbered the Norse settlers. After several years and several violent encounters, the Norse concluded that the land was too dangerous to hold against the native population and abandoned the settlement. The image of Norse society as purely militaristic, all feasting and fighting, is as false as the horned helmet. Norse society was, by the standards of medieval Europe, remarkably sophisticated in its legal structures and remarkably open in its treatment of women. The Thing, the local assembly, was the fundamental political institution of Norse society everywhere it appeared. Every free man had the right to speak at the Thing, to bring legal cases, and to participate in decisions. The law was not written down, but memorized by a specialist called the law speaker, who recited it publicly. It was the community's collective property, not a possession of the king or the church. Norse law recognized a wider range of personal rights than most contemporary legal systems. Slaves could accumulate property and buy their freedom. Freedmen had legal standing. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and manage households independently. A Norse woman who was mistreated by her husband could declare her intention to divorce him publicly in front of witnesses. This was legally binding. Divorce was uncommon, but not shameful. Remarriage after divorce or widowhood was entirely normal. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, but describing events of the 10th and 11th, preserve extraordinary details of everyday Norse life. We know what people ate: dried fish, skyr, a thick fermented dairy product still eaten in Iceland today, barley porridge, beef, mutton, whale meat, birds' eggs. We know what they wore: wool, linen, with fur trimming for the wealthy. We know their entertainment: storytelling, board games, skiing, horse fighting, poetry composition. Norse poetry, skaldic verse, was one of the most demanding art forms in medieval literature. A skald composed in complex meters with elaborate systems of kennings, compressed metaphorical phrases where the sea was the whale road, gold was the fire of the sea, a sword was the wound wand, blood was the sweat of the sword. Creating an effective kenning required not just poetic skill, but deep knowledge of mythology and legend. The skalds were court poets, comparable in status to warriors, remembered by name. Many of their verses survive.
The Viking Age produced one figure who achieved something no other Norse ruler had managed: a genuine North Sea empire spanning England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. His name was Canute in the anglicized form, and his story is one of the most underappreciated in medieval history. Canute was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who had conquered England in 1013, the first and only time England was completely conquered by an invading force before the Norman conquest in 1066. Sweyn died in 1014 after only 5 weeks as King of England, and the English invited the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred back. Canute, then probably in his late teens, had to fight his way back to the English throne. By 1016, Canute had conquered England. He was now King of England and, following his father's conquest, effectively ruler of Denmark. He proceeded to conquer Norway in 1028 and claim overlordship of parts of Scotland and Sweden.
At his peak, around 1030, Canute ruled a North Sea empire that was the largest political entity in northern Europe. But Canute was not a destroyer. He was, by the standards of the time, a remarkably effective and just ruler. He kept the existing English administrative structures almost completely intact. He maintained the Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. He issued law codes. He was a devoted supporter of the Christian Church, making generous grants to monasteries and making a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027. His letter to the English people from Rome is one of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval period, a king writing directly to his people, explaining his actions, promising justice, and acknowledging his obligations to them. The famous story of Canute and the waves, the king commanding the tide to stop and getting wet when it didn't, is universally misunderstood. In the original sources, Canute staged the demonstration precisely to show his courtiers that he was not all-powerful, that only God controlled the sea, and that they should stop flattering him with exaggerated praise of his powers. The story is not about a foolish king who thought he could stop the sea. It is about a wise king who deliberately got his feet wet to make a theological and political point.
The Norse myths we know, the stories of Odin and Thor, of Loki and Ragnarok, of Valhalla and the Valkyries, were written down not by the Vikings themselves in the heat of the Viking Age, but by Icelandic scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries, a full century after the formal conversion to Christianity. The primary sources are two: the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson around 1220 AD, and the Poetic Edda, a collection of older poems compiled around the same time. Snorri was a Christian Icelandic politician and historian, and an extraordinary writer. His Prose Edda preserves the Norse mythological system in remarkable detail, with the explicit stated purpose of helping young poets understand the ancient kennings that made skaldic verse comprehensible. Without Snorri, much of Norse mythology would be irretrievably lost. The Poetic Edda contains poems of great antiquity. Some may genuinely date back to the Viking Age or even earlier. The Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, is one of the most haunting poems in any language. A seeress, summoned by Odin, recounts the creation of the world, the lives of the gods, the coming of Ragnarok, and what lies beyond. It is a poem that encompasses the entire cosmic narrative, from creation to destruction to renewal, and it manages to be both terrible and beautiful. The Loki myths deserve particular attention. Loki is one of the most psychologically complex figures in any mythology. He is not purely evil. In early myths, he is Odin's companion and helper, using cunning to get the gods out of trouble as often as he creates it. He is funny, clever, sexually transgressive, capable of extraordinary shape-shifting. He is also ultimately responsible for Ragnarok. It is his son Fenrir who will devour Odin, his son Jormungandr who will kill Thor, his daughter Hel who rules the dead. Loki is the chaos principle embedded in the divine order, necessary, creative, and ultimately destructive. The influence of Norse mythology on modern popular culture is almost immeasurable. J.R.R. Tolkien drew heavily on Norse mythology for Middle-earth. The dwarves of his legendarium, the World Tree, Gandalf the Wandering Wizard are all Norse. Marvel Comics' Thor is based on the Norse god, however loosely. Wagner's Ring Cycle is based on Norse and Germanic legend. Wednesday is named for Odin, Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Frigg's Day. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. 4 days of every week are named for Norse gods.
The Icelandic sagas are one of the great literary traditions of world literature, and one of the least known outside Scandinavia and medieval studies. They are prose narratives, mostly written in the 12th and 13th centuries, describing events of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, the age of settlement in Iceland and the Viking Age. They read astonishingly like modern realistic fiction. The saga style is characterized by understatement, objective narration, and what literary scholars call Icelandic laconic, the tendency to describe extreme violence or extreme emotion with complete flatness of tone. A man is killed. His killer sits down to eat. No explanation is offered for the killer's lack of visible emotion because none is needed. Everyone understood that showing emotion was not a Norse cultural practice. The gaps and silences in the sagas are as important as what is said. Egil's saga, possibly written by Snorri Sturluson, follows Egil Skallagrimsson, a poet and warrior of extraordinary ugliness and extraordinary talent, from his birth to his blind old age. Egil is violent, difficult, quarrelsome, and capable of verse of haunting beauty. His lament, Sonatoric, composed after the deaths of his sons, is one of the earliest first-person grief poems in any European literature, and one of the most raw. Njál's saga is considered the masterpiece of the form, a sprawling narrative covering 50 years of Icelandic history, following a network of families through feuds, legal disputes, marriages, betrayals, and the final catastrophic burning of Njál and his family in their hall. It is a novel, a better novel than most actual novels, written 700 years before the novel was supposed to have been invented. The sagas preserve extraordinary historical detail, descriptions of legal procedures, agricultural practices, trade goods, ships, clothing, food, and social customs that archaeologists and historians use alongside physical evidence to reconstruct Viking Age life. They are not purely reliable as history. They were written generations after the events they described, and they served social and political purposes for their authors. But as windows into a vanished world and as literature, they remain remarkable.
The Vikings as traders, not raiders, is the chapter of the story that gets least attention in popular history, because trading is less photogenic than raiding. But trade was at least as important as raiding to the Norse economy, and the Norse trading networks were among the most extensive in the medieval world. The Norse were not just exporting violence, they were exporting furs from the forests of Scandinavia and Russia, sable, beaver, marten, squirrel, which were enormously valuable in the luxury markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. They were exporting amber from the Baltic coast, walrus ivory from Greenland and the Arctic, slaves captured in raids from Ireland to the Slavic East, falcons for the aristocratic sport of falconry, dried fish, the stockfish of Norway, preserved by winter winds, which could last for years and fed half of medieval Europe during Lent. In return, Norse merchants brought home silver, above all silver, in enormous quantities from the Arab world. The hoards of silver buried in Viking Age Scandinavia and recovered by archaeologists contained coins from every corner of the known world: Byzantine gold solidi, Arab dirhams, English pennies, Frankish deniers, all melted down or used as hack silver, weighed by the chunk rather than counted by the coin. The Norse trading towns were extraordinary places. Birka in Sweden was an international trading center on Lake Mälaren from the 8th to 10th centuries, its cemetery containing goods from across Eurasia, silk from China, beads from the Middle East, weapons from the Frankish Empire. Hedeby in southern Jutland,
Modern Schleswig-Holstein in Germany was one of the largest towns in northern Europe. Kaupang in Norway, Ribe in Denmark. These were not primitive villages. They were sophisticated mercantile centers with specialized craftsmen, permanent market stalls, and international connections. The Norse also invented a credit system that preceded most European banking institutions. The trading partnerships and the network of obligations that bound Norse merchants were essentially proto-financial instruments, agreements to supply goods in exchange for future payment, networks of trust that functioned across thousands of kilometers of ocean and river. Recent archaeology has significantly revised the old picture of the Viking world as exclusively male. Women were more central to Norse society, more legally empowered, and occasionally more militarily involved than the traditional picture suggested. The most dramatic revision came in 2017 when a reanalysis of a Viking burial at Birka, a grave containing a warrior's weapons, horses, and gaming pieces, indicating a military commander's status, revealed through genetic analysis that the occupant was biologically female. The warrior grave, assumed for over a century to be male simply because it contained weapons, was a woman. Historians are now re-examining the entire corpus of Viking Age burials with fresh eyes. The sagas mention shield maidens, women who fought as warriors. The historicity of individual shield maidens is debated, but the cultural concept was clearly real, and the Birka burial suggests some women did live warrior lives. The mythological Valkyries, warrior women who chose the slain on battlefields, may have had some basis in real social practice. More certain is the legal and economic power of Norse women. A Norse woman managed the household, which in a farming context was a substantial operation involving food production, textile manufacture, livestock management, and the supervision of slaves and servants. She held the keys to the household stores, which was a literal and symbolic marker of authority. When her husband was away, raiding, trading, on pilgrimage, she was the sole authority in the household for months or years at a time. Gudrid Thorbjörnadottir is perhaps the most remarkable Norse woman in the historical record. She was born in Iceland, traveled to Greenland, sailed to Vinland in North America, where she gave birth to the first European born in the Americas, returned to Iceland, and then made a pilgrimage to Rome. She reportedly spent her last years as an anchoress, a female Christian hermit. Her life spanned the known world from North America to Rome, and she lived most of it as a widow making independent decisions. She is commemorated in Iceland today as the most widely traveled woman in medieval history.
The Viking Age ended with remarkable symbolic neatness. In September 1066, two great battles within 3 weeks of each other closed the era of Norse dominance in England and opened the era of Norman dominance that would define English history for the next 2 centuries. Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler, King of Norway, was the last great Viking conqueror. He had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, fought across the Mediterranean, become King of Norway through brutal civil war, and in 1066 launched an invasion of England with a fleet reportedly of 300 ships to claim the English throne. He believed he had a legitimate claim through the agreements made by his predecessor, Magnus the Good, with the Danish king Harthacnut. On September 25, 1066, Harald Hardrada's army met the English army of King Harold Godwinson at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. The Norse army had left their armor at their ships because the summer march had been so easy. They expected no serious resistance. They were wrong. In a few hours of brutal fighting, Harald Hardrada was killed by an arrow through the throat.
His co-commander, the treacherous Earl Tostig, who was Harold Godwinson's own brother, was also killed. Of the 300 ships that had arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold Godwinson received word as he was celebrating his victory at Stamford Bridge that another invasion fleet had landed in the south. William of Normandy, the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, the Norse chieftain, had crossed the English Channel. Harold force-marched his army 300 miles south in less than 2 weeks. He should have rested. He attacked anyway. At the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, 19 days after Stamford Bridge, Harold was killed, almost certainly by an arrow, and the Norman conquest of England began. The symmetry is almost too neat. The Viking Age began with raids on English monasteries, and it ended with a Norse-descended duke from Normandy conquering England at a battle fought 19 days after the last pure Norse army was destroyed at Stamford Bridge. The Norse didn't just end the Viking Age, they transformed it. They became the Norman French aristocracy that would rule England, and from England, much of the medieval Atlantic world. Now I want to return to the mystery I mentioned at the start. The Norse settled Greenland around 985 AD and maintained communities there for approximately 500 years. The last written record from Greenland is from 1408. After that, silence. What happened to the Greenland Norse? The mystery has fascinated historians for centuries, and the answer, pieced together by modern archaeology, climatology, and historical analysis, turns out to be a deeply human story about the failure to adapt. The key factor was climate. The Norse settled Greenland during the medieval warm period, a time of relatively mild temperatures across the North Atlantic that made the marginal agriculture of southwestern Greenland just barely viable. Beginning around 1300 AD, temperatures began to fall, the beginning of the Little Ice Age. The growing seasons shortened, the seas became icier and harder to navigate. The fjords froze later in spring. The pastures that had supported Norse cattle became less productive. The Inuit, the Thule culture people who had migrated east across Arctic Canada, arrived in Greenland around 1200 to 1300 AD and were much better adapted to the changing conditions. The Inuit had kayaks, which the Norse did not adopt. They had toggle-headed harpoons for hunting seals in open water, which the Norse did not adopt. They had sod houses that retained heat far better than Norse-style construction. They had clothing made of seal and caribou skin with superior insulating properties. The Norse, clinging to their European identity and European farming practices, did not adapt. The Inuit thrived. The Norse did not. Archaeological evidence from the final Norse settlements is sobering. The cattle bones in late-period middens are from increasingly young animals. The herds were collapsing, and people were eating animals they would previously have kept for milk and breeding. The people themselves show signs of malnutrition. They ate their dogs. There is no evidence of a dramatic catastrophe. No massacre, no plague, just a slow, grinding failure of resources, and a community that was too committed to its identity to adopt the survival strategies of the people living beside them. They did not survive because they could not imagine being Inuit.
The legacy of the Vikings in language is everywhere once you start looking. We have already mentioned the Old Norse words embedded in English, but the extent goes further than most people realize. The personal names. Thursday is Thor's Day. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, Tyr being the Norse god of single combat and justice. Wednesday is Woden's Day,
Odin's Day. Friday is Frigg's Day, Frigg being Odin's wife. 4 days of the 7-day week carry the names of Norse gods. Every time you write the date, you invoke the Norse pantheon. The place names of northern and eastern England remain predominantly Old Norse after 1,000 years of English history. The by ending, meaning farm or settlement, Derby, the deer farm, Grimsby, Grimm's farm, Whitby, the white farm, Selby, Rugby, Naseby. The Thorpe ending, Scunthorpe, Mablethorpe, Cleethorpes. The Thwaite ending, meaning clearing, Braithwaite, Slaithwaite, Stonethwaite. Toft, meaning homestead, Home, meaning island or water meadow, Beck, meaning stream, Dale, meaning valley. The landscape of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire speaks Old Norse. Scottish place names in the west and north are saturated with Norse. The I ending, meaning island, gives us Orkney, Skye, Jura, Islay. The Vig, meaning bay, gives us Scalloway, Lerwick. The entire Orkney and Shetland Island groups were Norse-speaking until the 15th century, when Scotland finally obtained them from Norway as a dowry payment. The dialects spoken in Orkney and Shetland as late as the 18th century were a form of Old Norse called Norn. In Ireland, the Norse founding of Dublin is commemorated in the names of many Dublin neighborhoods: Clontarf, Stoneybatter, Oxmantown. The Irish language absorbed Norse loanwords for concepts the Irish didn't previously have European-style terms for. Margad, the Irish word for market, comes from Norse markaðr. The Irish word for a penny, pingin, comes from Norse penningur. The Norse were in Ireland long enough that their vocabulary became part of the local language. The Vikings have been reimagined by every generation since the Viking Age ended, and each generation's reimagining tells us more about that generation than about the actual Norse people. The medieval Christian perspective was straightforward. The Norse were pagans, agents of divine punishment sent to scourge a sinful people, similar to the role the Assyrians played in the Hebrew Bible. Monastic chroniclers describe them with genuine terror and theological bewilderment. How could God allow holy places to be desecrated? The answer was always, because we deserved it. The Romantic period of the 18th and 19th century discovered the Norse as noble savages, free, natural, uncontaminated by civilization's corruptions. The Germanic Romantic nationalist movement found in the Norse the origins of a pure Germanic people. Wagner's Ring Cycle drew on Norse and Germanic legend to create a mythology for the German nation. This association of Norse mythology with German nationalism would later have deeply sinister applications when the Nazi movement appropriated Norse imagery, the SS runes, Valhalla as a term for a hall of honored dead, in ways that would have been alien to any actual Norse person. The mid-20th century gave us the cinematic Viking, Kirk Douglas in The Vikings, 1958, muscular, horned-helmeted, drinking from skulls. The late 20th century gave us Asterix's broadly comic Vikings and the sanitized Norse of children's entertainment. The 21st century has given us something more interesting. The History Channel's Viking series, which ran for 6 seasons and was watched by tens of millions of people, introducing the Norse world to a generation that knew almost nothing about it. Flawed as historical fiction, it was extraordinary as cultural transmission.
The video game God of War, particularly the 2018 Norse mythology-based installment and its 2022 sequel Ragnarok, introduced Norse mythology to a generation of young people with remarkable fidelity to the original sources. The game's version of Kratos navigating Norse mythology with his son Atreus prompted players to read the Eddas and the sagas. A Sony PlayStation game sending people to medieval Icelandic poetry is not a small cultural achievement.
Let's be honest about what made the Norse remarkable. Not in the romanticized sense of noble warriors, but in the precise historical sense of a people who achieved things that, given their population and resources, should have been impossible. The population of Scandinavia during the Viking Age was probably between 1 and 2 million people. From this relatively small population base, the Norse managed to raid or settle every coastline of Western Europe, found states in Russia, Normandy, Sicily, and briefly North America, control the trade routes from the Baltic to Baghdad, and produce a literary culture of genuine excellence. For every Viking who went raiding, there were dozens who stayed home farming. The Norse punched far, far above their demographic weight. The explanation lies in the combination of extraordinary maritime technology and a culture that valued individual initiative and tolerated risk in ways that hierarchical feudal societies did not. Any Norse freeman could gather a crew of willing men, build or buy a ship, and go where his ambition took him. The institution of the thing ensured that even bold individual action operated within a legal framework. You could do almost anything if you were willing to answer for it legally afterward. The Norse were also genuinely adaptable in practice, even if they resisted adaptation in theory. They learned from every culture they encountered. They adopted the Frankish cavalry tactics that proved superior to their infantry. They absorbed Arabic navigational knowledge. They learned Byzantine siege engineering. The Varangian Guard became indistinguishable from Byzantine soldiers over time. The Norse settlers in France became Normans, and the Normans became the most effective military force in 11th century Europe. And then they converted to Christianity and almost immediately became indistinguishable from their Christian neighbors, which was probably inevitable given how thoroughly they had intermarried, traded, and integrated with the people they had once raided. The most Viking thing the Norse ever did may have been to stop being Vikings. The direct institutional legacies of the Viking Age are more significant than most people realize. Democracy. The Althing of Iceland, founded in 930 AD, is the oldest continuously functioning parliament in the world. The Thing system, the local assembly of free men that the Norse practiced everywhere they settled, was a model of participatory governance that contrasts sharply with the feudal top-down governance of the rest of medieval Europe. When the Normans brought their Norse-derived legal traditions to England, they brought with them habits of consultation and assembly that would eventually feed into the development of English parliamentary tradition. Trade networks. The Norse created or significantly extended the trading routes that connected the economies of Northern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world during the early medieval period. The silver that flowed from Arab mints to Scandinavian hoards via Russian rivers kept the Northern European economy monetized during a period when much of Europe had reverted to barter. Without the Norse trade networks, the economic recovery of medieval Europe would have been significantly slower. Exploration. The Norse discovered and settled Iceland, Greenland, and North America, the last named 5 centuries before Columbus.
They pushed the boundaries of the known world further and faster than any other people of their era. Their navigational methods, using the sun, stars, ocean swells, bird behavior, and possibly a mysterious sunstone crystal that could locate the sun on overcast days, were sophisticated enough to cross the North Atlantic reliably in open boats. Language. The Old Norse vocabulary embedded in English, the Old Norse-derived languages of Scandinavia, and the profound Norse influence on the development of narrative literature through the saga tradition, these are living legacies that persist to this day. The sagas pioneered the realistic prose narrative, the character study, and the psychological portrait of individuals under extreme stress. In ways that medieval literary historians are still tracing, the development of the European novel owes something to the Icelandic sagas.
We have been traveling for 2 hours now, from the frozen shores of Norway in the 8th century to the falling cathedrals of Constantinople, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the green shores of Newfoundland, from the burning of Lindisfarne to the Battle of Hastings, from the laws of the Althing to the poems of the Skalds. What does the Viking story mean? Not what the Vikings thought it meant. They would have said it meant glory, silver, and the chance to die well enough for Valhalla. But what does it mean for us, looking back from a distance of 1,000 years? The Viking story is first a story about the relationship between geography and destiny. The Norse were shaped by their landscape, the fjords that pushed them to the sea, the short growing seasons that made poverty a constant companion, the forests that gave them timber for their extraordinary ships. They did not choose their circumstances, they chose what to do with them. That is the only choice that matters. It is also a story about cultural identity and the limits of identity. The Greenland Norse died, at least in part, because they could not bring themselves to adopt Inuit practices that might have saved them. Their identity as Christian, European, Norse people was more real to them than their survival. There is something both admirable and tragic about this. The Norsemen who settled in France became French. The ones in Russia became Russian. The ones in England became English. The ones who clung most tightly to being Norse at the edge of the habitable world disappeared. And the Viking story is a story about violence and its complications. The Norse were genuinely, dramatically violent people by any objective measure. They enslaved thousands of people. They killed monks on their altars. They burned towns. This cannot and should not be romanticized away. And yet the same culture that produced the berserker also produced the Althing, the sagas, the kennings, the ships, the legal traditions, the exploration of the world. Violence and civilization are not opposites in human history. They are, disturbingly, companions. The Viking story holds that discomfort, and it does not resolve it, because it cannot be resolved. It can only be understood. And with that, we have reached the end of our journey through the Viking Age. From the first longship beaching on a Northumbrian shore in 793 A.D. to the last Norse army breaking apart at Stamford Bridge in 1066. From the poetry of the Skalds to the ruins of Lance o' Meadows, from Odin's ravens to the last candle in a Greenland church. We missed things, as we always do.
The full story of the Norse in Ireland deserves its own 2 hours. The founding of Dublin, the Battle of Clontarf, the extraordinary cultural fusion of Norse and Irish. The full story of the Kievan Rus and the development of the Russian state could fill another evening. The Viking Age in the Mediterranean, Norse mercenaries in Sicily, Norse raiders reaching the Strait of Gibraltar, the extraordinary Roger of Sicily, who was a Norman Norse ruler of a multilingual, multi-religious island kingdom, is a whole chapter we barely touched. But I hope you leave tonight with a different picture of the Norse than the one you arrived with. Not the horned, helmeted raider, that never existed. Not the noble savage of romantic imagination, that was a projection. But the real people, complicated, violent, funny, legally sophisticated, poetically gifted, genuinely brave, genuinely cruel, capable of extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary treachery, shaped by the hardest landscape in Europe into people who went out and changed the world. They named 4 days of your week. Their words are in your mouth every time you speak English. Their democratic instincts fed into the parliaments that govern much of the world. Their ships are the most elegant transport technology the pre-industrial world produced. Their myths gave us Thor's hammer and Odin's ravens, and the beautiful, terrible concept of Ragnarok, the doom that is coming, that cannot be stopped, that you face anyway, because how you face it is all that you control. This has been Boring History for Sleep. If you made it to the end of a 2-hour Viking history, sleeping or not, you belong here. Subscribe. Leave a comment telling me what part of the Viking story you want more of, and come back next time. We have a lot more history to get through. Good night. Skål.